Now the same idea when we bring it with elasticities. In the first case, I'm doing the demand is elastic. It's much more flatter, as you can see. And when you impose an indirect tax, price went up just slightly up and the quantity fell by quite a lot. I'll follow the same procedure. The vertical distance is the tax rate. Okay, where it intersects my original supply curve, I do a marking of P2 right there. Okay, so this is the tax rate, of which the consumer price just went up by a quarter of the total tax rate. But since the government wants the entire tax, somebody has to pay the leftover. So the consumer burden is this, hardly any. So in case of luxury, we say consumer hardly takes on any burden because they show a big response in a change in quantity. And so the producer has no choice but to cut down, but has to bear the majority of the tax. Okay, they're going to be bearing. But in the case of an inelastic good, where the demand is inelastic, that means it's kind of like a necessity good. Okay, we'll do the same procedure. At the new equilibrium, the vertical distance is the tax rate. The problem where the kids have is this lower P2. Where am I making this P2? The P2 is on the equilibrium, new equilibrium quantity, and the vertical distance between the supply curves. So now the tax rate P1 se P2 is the tax rate, of which the consumer has to pay almost 4/5 of the tax. So all of this goes into the consumer's burden, and a very tiny fraction goes into the producer's burden. So in case of inelastic, the consumer has to bear most of the burden, and the consumer has to bear most of the burden, and producer hardly. And it's very natural because it's an inelastic. It can be an addictive good, it can be a necessity good, it can be a good which takes a very small proportion of your income. So even if the tax comes, the producer knows that the quantity is not going to fall by much, so we don't have to worry about the tax in that case. Okay, similarly, you're going to be dealing with the supply curves. Okay, about how the supply curves, if it was elastic and inelastic, and how would they go with the special cases. Okay, special cases I will not deal with in this video and in this lecture. You can look at the class notes for those. So since I just want to conclude that you should know how to deal with if the supply was elastic and supply was inelastic, how do you deal with that? So suppose in first case I'll do supply is highly elastic, and so that's the quantity and that's my price. Okay, and I am imposing an indirect tax. Okay, so I'll shift the supply curve upwards like this. Okay, and so my new equilibrium, follow the steps. I think 2-3 saal pehle this question came in your essay that show how indirect taxes will affect the prices of the good and the quantity for that good. So you had to discuss different scenarios, including the elasticities in the discussion. So these diagrams were important in that. So once the indirect taxes have been imposed, let's do the vertical distance is the tax rate. Let's find P2. P2 is right over here. Okay, I know when I've done this in class with you guys, we saw how, every in the beginning, sometimes the kids, when they don't understand where P2 is, they're just randomly putting the marks. Remember, these dotted lines are the reference lines. They have to be at specific areas. They can't be at wherever you want to plot them. Now, of the tax rate from P1 to P2, we can clearly see that the consumer, the price change is the bigger proportion. So the consumer burden is far greater than the producer's burden, which is just a very small, tiny fraction. So in case if supply is elastic, that means producers can easily change the supply for the good. They get some sort of power in their hands that whenever the quantity, whenever the tax has been imposed, without taking much burden, they can manipulate the quantity in the market. However, if it was a case where the producers really does not have the power to uh, change their quantity, they are kind of like stuck by the nature of the good. And let's suppose an indirect tax has been imposed. Okay, supply curve shifts left or upwards, and your new equilibrium is at Q1, price is P1. Let's find the tax rate. Vertical distance is the tax rate. Here's P2, and so this is my tax rate. You can clearly see the consumer, for them the price just went up by this much, but as far as the producers go, they have to pay the leftover tax. So just 1/3 goes to the consumer in this case, and 2/3 goes to the producer. That's how we deal with the burdens. All right, consumers, who bears more burdens, this is how the elasticities is suggesting. So this is supply elastic and supply inelastic.